My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas. Today in South Africa is a public holiday called Freedom Day. The world doesn't really care too much about that. But what is interesting is that this is the day that South Africa officially became a post-apartheid country. In other words, it's the day that all South Africans voted in a national election back in 1994. Now, I was too young to vote. Of course, it's called Freedom Day, which is ironic because what freedom? I mean, does everybody think that being locked down and, being told to get vaccinated is freedom? It's insane. But at the same time, the whole discussion around apartheid, I think, is, at least for somebody who's South African, is important because the world largely thinks it was just white Afrikaners that did this. But if you actually look into it, it goes all the way back to Cecil John Rhodes. And I hate doing this sometimes because it sounds like I'm always dunking on the US and the UK, but it is what it is. It is part of history. And the UK particularly had a huge role to play in the creation of apartheid. I don't know if you know that.
Well, I think we can treat you as the subject matter expert on this one, can't we? Why don't you go on and go a bit further? What I would say, though, sorry, just to invert briefly, I mean, it's sort of amusing in a way to think that there are 365 days in the year and yet just one of them is a Freedom Day. But no, go on. Tell us more.
Well, look, I mean, every country's got its history. Sitting here in Cape Town, am a result of effectively, the British coming down to the southern tip. And it is what it is, and I'm very happy to be South African, and I can't change history, and my family and extended family, etc., multiple generations. But what is very interesting to me is how little is known about the kind of deep state intelligence operations that were involved in setting up not just apartheid, but the post-apartheid era. It was the British government as well as the American government that attempted to preserve the apartheid system, which is ironic because they helped set it up, and then infiltrate the post-apartheid system with huge amounts of help from Israeli intelligence, which we now have today. So whether or not you can claim that South Africa is now out or separated from apartheid, it isn't really, because of the amount of foreign infiltration in our not only in our government but in our private sector. I mean, I told you previously that in 1994, Anglo-American held something like a quarter of it was way more. It was nearly half of all private industry in South Africa, and of course Namibia played a huge part in the Angolan border wars. Also, there were all these attempts to try and preserve a system that was obviously going to fail. I grew up in it, and there are pros and cons. I'm not going to just say it was all bad. It's a bit too binary. There were obviously good aspects of a system like that, but overall, I think the net benefit was not a good one. And you're never going to win the future by creating such an authoritarian system over society. Anyway, I'm just kind of rambling, but today is that day.
Yeah, I mean, Jerm, this is kind of a continuation of the discussion we had last week. And it's interesting that the discussion about multipolarity that we had resulted in conversations with people that, how do I put this? What I discovered was that pretty much confirmed what I knew already. Actually, the people that may disagree with us on what we said on multipolarity last week probably aren't that, or rather we're not that far away from their position. Actually, it's inevitable that if a system is changing and the establishment power that was there before is being kicked out, it's going to want to try and co-opt whatever comes next. It's going to try to steer whatever comes next. And I don't know enough about the post-apartheid government in South Africa to really comment in detail about it, but it is a theme historically that, you know, when empires disappear, the main driver for the reason for the colonialism in the first place, which is, you know, is always economic, is still wanting to have that economic control. So they will attempt to bribe or kill and make sure that they maintain that control in whatever follows. So, you know, but I think there's a lot of focus on reparations and truth, and reconciliation and these kinds of things for what has happened in the past. It seems to me that the people that were actually the victims of that colonialism aren't around anymore because it's historic. Their successors are, and maybe those people's lives would have been different. But of course, there's no way to know how those people's lives would have been different if the colonialism hadn't happened. So how do you make reparations for that? But the more important question is, if we agree that colonialism is not something that we should be supporting, then what lessons can we take historically that make sure that we recognize that type of exploitative behavior from governments and from corporations? And increasingly these days, it is a corporate colonialism that happens. Well, how do we recognize that behavior, and how do we oppose it if we think that it's not a good thing?
Well, like I said, look at Gaza. So there's definitely that. Well, I mean, there's a variation of that happening there.
Well, there's certainly an openly stated goal that you know, people in that part of the world need to move out of the way to create this super resort that they've declared they want to create. So how does that sit with the average person in the street? Is that something that we're comfortable with? I'm certainly not comfortable with that, because if they are willing to do that they're willing to do it anywhere. It's everything that we're talking about here is a representation of how those who desire to be at the top of the pyramid, whether it's at a political level or a financial level or a corporate level, how they think about ordinary human beings. You know, I've used the phrase "we are being farmed," and I've used it many times, and I believe it's absolutely right. It doesn't matter what the harvest is. Increasingly, it's digital, it's data. But you know, the average human being is exploited by the political and corporate elites, and that exploitation maintains them with their as a billionaire Epstein class, which makes the whole left-right paradigm just so absolutely ridiculous, because this is something which only applies to the man in the street. It's only the man in the street that thinks in these terms. And yes, there are some play actors that sit at the political level and pretend to be on one side of the political spectrum or the other. You know, we've said it before on this program. We've got to be thinking in terms of up-down rather than left and right, and start recognizing that the differences between us as individuals aren't that great. And we might argue about, you know, this detail or that detail, but if we actually talk to each other, then maybe we find who the real target of our interest should be.
The undercurrent of what I was saying is not necessary to have a discussion about apartheid South Africa and Freedom Day, which is today, because that's very domestic. But the parallel. So let me give you context. I'm going to read you a paragraph here that will create the context, which you'll easily understand what I'm getting at. So the history summarized is basically from Cecil John Rhodes and Rothschild money in the 1880s through British colonial race laws, Cold War, CIA operations, the illegal occupation of Namibia, the Angolan War, and Western corporations plundering the region's minerals, all the way to the military defeat in Quito Cornwallis, which is in Angola, that finally forced the whole apartheid system to collapse. Now, with Israel woven throughout the secret military alliance, the offer to sell nuclear warheads, Israeli officers in Angola, and the ongoing influence of Israeli-linked money in South African politics today, apartheid wasn't an Afrikaner idea. It was a Western project built for profit, maintained by the empire, to maintain the empire, with Israel as one of its most intimate partners. You can immediately see the parallels here.
Yes, absolutely. I would say this, just to go back, obviously we've referred back to what we spoke about last week and multipolarity.
In Africa,
I think, yeah, but I think an important part of that was the necessity to define terms, or at least to try to define terms, or just to put out there that when we say one thing, somebody else might actually be thinking something that's similar but distinct. And I think a part of this, which you've already alluded to, is the idea that colonialism represents a particular thing in people's minds. And I think that is another thing that means that we need to define terms. Talking about Rhodes or any of the people that were involved in that period at that time, Milner or Jameson or any of those guys, that was primarily about personal fortune. And I spoke about greed last week because I think that the idea of multipolarity as a racket in which everybody loses because it's all coordinated, to me, doesn't stack up on that basis because of greed and the idea that people will actually act collaboratively for a shared goal. And I think that colonialism is an interesting example in this respect, in that if you go back, if we acknowledge that in the modern era, the start of the colonial period was, in a way, born of the actions of the East India Company. Now that was started entirely as a private venture, and only after a certain amount of time was a sort of government architecture laid over the top of it, which was then the model for the colonial project. That there were corporate interests and government activity were overlaid and overlapped until such point as that became either impractical or impossible. But that's not to say that the corporate interests just think, right, okay, well, that's that. We'll move off and do something else. That's not how it works at all. And that's exactly why when you describe South Africa going back in the grip that Anglo-American had, that there might be divergences and convergences, but ultimately they are sort of parallel tracks. And so I think that the times at which we see, superficially at least, change, like, apartheid begins or it ends or whatever. In fact, if you look at the activities of a particular organisation, they're probably going to be on a more or less flat line. And I think that is a really important point to make. And certainly with regard to reparations, or this sort of universal idea that the colonial period was bad, I'm not advocating for it. But what I would say is that because of the overlay at that point, it meant that at least the colonial power, in most instances, let's use the British model as an example, they were at least investing the time and effort into producing a state architecture. So they created infrastructure, they created bureaucracy, they created a health and education system and all that kind of thing. So they made sure that the the area, the provinces they were running did actually run at the same time as gifting the resources and all the rest of it to the corporate interests. I think what's happened in the colonial or the post-colonial period is that side of it, of course, has just totally fallen away, and you're only left with the corporate plundering. So I think it should just make people think a little bit about the sort of baby and bathwater thing. And again, I'm not saying, oh yeah, we should just wind the clock back, restart the colonial projects, but it is. I think it is just interesting when you consider it in those terms, and then to your point about there always being the intent that whoever was involved in the first place, they absolutely want to keep their hand in. Of course they do. Well, look at Iran. Go back to 1953 and then 1979 and then now. I mean, effectively, it's the same actors trying to manipulate the same outcome, just via whichever means are appropriate for that particular period. And if the project goes south, well, you just have to change tack, and you have to do something that tries to reassert your control over the situation. So I think all of this is completely fascinating, but it is really, in many ways, it's very complicated. I think in other ways it's actually quite simple, because we are always going to be dealing with corporate greed, and we were always going to be looking at the involvement and the apparent levels of control that are held by governments. But are we accurate in describing it like that? So when we consider multipolarity and we talk about the, say, United States being the dominant force economically and militarily, whatever, in sort of world affairs, is that accurate? Should we really be regarding that as the efforts or the control of that country, or of the corporations that are in effect representing that country because they're based there, or they're American individuals? Which way do we look at it? How much complexity should we build into any discussion about this?
Yeah, I mean, your point is well made about not changing history. You can't obviously change history. Things are what they are. I mean, if it weren't for the arrival of the Europeans in the Cape, we wouldn't have the Afrikaner population. They are entirely a result of that. And that is now part of African history. But the point that I was making is that there is a lot of misunderstanding, I think, and incorrect conclusions being made, where ultimately we see the same pattern over and over and over, where you have intelligence operations and, as you point out, corporations. I mean, Anglo-American is not a government operation, it's a private operation, but it is exceptionally powerful, same as BlackRock, which has, fingers in every single pie.
Jerm, this is we can't just let that pass, because that is a fascinating angle to this, and it's something that it's very, very hard to get a definitive answer on. What is the control hierarchy? Is it that corporate is at the top because corporate is using its corporate money to fund politics, or is it that political agendas help drive corporate interests?
It's both, isn't it?
Yeah. It's without doubt a symbiotic relationship. But is it Israel driving Trump at the moment, or is Israel acting on behalf of something else? It's a very it's the kind of thing that people argue about forever, actually, and in a sense, it's an interesting conversation. I'm not sure that it's useful to get too far into the weeds of it, but it just, I think it's worth just highlighting the fact that it's not clear exactly what, at that level, the precise hierarchy of hierarchy is and how it operates.
I think it's a really... Sorry, Mike. Yeah, go on.
No, go ahead.
No, sorry. I was just going to say, I think it is. I think it's completely fascinating. Also, especially if we consider it from a financial point of view, which is that a government doesn't have any money. and it doesn't really have any people either. It's got a bunch of paper shufflers or digital paper shufflers sitting in Westminster, sitting in Whitehall. But apart from that, it doesn't have anything. It uses the money of the people that are passively, at least, supporting it, whereas corporations do have their own people. They do employ people and they generate money through different means. So in many respects, they do hold, on the face of it, much more power than governments. And I think I'm not suggesting we have a definitive answer to this, but you and I, insofar as a lot of the news items we cover, I mean, it's so often the case that we will look at the way in which particularly the British government is presenting a way in which it's influencing something, often in another part of the world. And in fact, when you read between the lines or when you look further into it, in actual fact, this will be a collaboration often between two or more corporations that's going to deliver a particular outcome. And effectively, all the government is really doing is just rubber stamping that and saying that was also part of our idea, wanting to piggyback what it is that was ultimately already going to happen. And I do find that sort of continually fascinating in terms of how we do regard this balance of power and what it is exactly that does drive what.
It seems to be a relationship, though.
One of the other things that governments do is facilitate, and they provide a legislative framework through which corporations can operate,
and enforcement,
and which, absolutely, but which actively prevent any kind of challenge to that corporate power. So it's impossible for individuals or small groups of people to in any way realistically compete with the big boys, because the legislative burden is onerous in many cases, and so people have got to look for a particular niche that they can maybe break into that doesn't have quite the same. But we've been talking on the column for the last number of years about MHRA and with respect to healthcare, and with Ofcom with respect to telecoms and media, that they are increasingly open about wanting to facilitate, create a regime which is one in which helps these corporate interests achieve their goals, rather than regulating to protect on the face of it, a regulator is there to protect the general public from the excesses and the extremes, and the possibility that corporate entities will try to shortcut safety and these kinds of things. But of course, increasingly, we're seeing the regulator being a facilitator, and that gives a good glimpse into the relationship between politics and corporate.
But I mean, as Catherine Austin-Fitz points out, you've got this public-private partnership occurring with the central banks. For example, the Federal Reserve, which is supposedly private, but the head of the Federal Reserve is appointed by the President of the United States. How is that in any way a private company? And the same thing happens here, by the way, in South Africa. The head of the South African Reserve Bank is appointed by the president. So you have a relationship. That's the point.
Yes, it is absolutely symbiotic. But the fact that the Prime Minister of the UK has a role in the appointment of the Governor of the Bank of England, or the fact that the President has a role in the appointment of the head of the Fed, doesn't really change what those organizations are. They are corporate in nature, it is a three-way thing, actually, as Charles rightly points out, because you cannot ignore the financial aspect of this, and so the banks, the corporations, and the government act together to create what we might call empire. But empire is, we're taught in school that empire is about countries occupying other countries and creating a mirror of your own political system in those countries. And our school education basically ignores the financial and the or at least mine did largely, the financial and the corporate aspect of this. But in fact, it's the financial and the corporate aspect which is the true nature of colonialism and corporate and empire. It always has been historically too.
Charles.
Well, I mean, no, I totally agree. I think that's my point about looking at the East India Company as the model, the template. And, what a classic. For anyone who's not familiar with the geography of London, where the Foreign Office, which still occupies very grand buildings, and in fact, just as a side to that, Mike, I was thinking the other day, we walked past the Foreign Office in late November. We'd just been to an exhibition run by the excellent Jake Fern, his 1,000 Words podcast. I just thought I'd shoehorn that in. But we were walking through the Foreign Office, and that part of central London since, I don't know what's been sort of I suppose since 2001, has been absolutely riddled with police and sort of, over the top security barriers and all that kind of stuff. And yet, lo and behold, directly opposite the main entrance to the Foreign Office is a sort of tented camp occupied by, I think, only one person, apparently protesting against the oppression of the Iranian regime. And I say this is going back to November 25. I think it had been there for some time. And the question has to be, why? How is it that everybody else gets swept off the streets, as soon as they've put their deck chair down to argue the toss over anything, and yet somebody is able to occupy a space that's pretty much the size of a tennis court directly opposite the Foreign Office and protest on this issue that, lo and behold, has just come into the spotlight. That is an interesting side note. But no, the point I was going to make is that the statue at the western end of the Foreign Office is of Clive of India, who, again, I mean, I'm not best qualified perhaps to talk about this, but it can be said with, I think, a fair degree of certainty that his actions and decisions were absolutely not to the benefit of the people of the Indian subcontinent at that time. However, they did create enormous personal wealth for him. And he is, in effect, the emblem of the Foreign Office, which was, it's absolutely articulating what I'm saying, which is the overlaying of government policy at that point, government policy onto private and corporate interest. And that's their sort of, here we are, this Foreign Office, this is what we do. Have a look at the behaviour of Clive of India. I mean, it's there for all to see. Of course, it's lost on, I would say, 99% of the people that do walk up those steps, because all it says on the plinth is Clive, doesn't give any detail. But that is, I think that is not to be ignored. That is absolutely how it started. And for the state as it was then, of course, is a very different state that we talk about now. But this is the thing. The way in which those two entities have become completely and utterly enmeshed in each other and symbiotic, now largely due to the fact that the majority of people working in either of those fields do periodically cross the lines. Now many politicians are, if not ex-employees of corporations, they're on the board of, or this, that and the other. I mean, there's the permeability, one imagines, of information flowing both ways is absolute. So I think it would be naive in the extreme to imagine that that we wouldn't be in the situation we're in now.
And here we are, 21st century, and exactly the same gag, because, as we know, Trump launches his war in Iran, and suddenly we have undisclosed people making tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, speculating on every action that Trump takes. And strangely enough, people seem to be on the right side of every one of those bets, as if they knew what was going to come. It's the same kind of profiteering from government decisions. It's
It is staggering. No, but this, I think, Mike, this is what's so important about this. Going back to the, I don't want to suggest that there are distinctions where there aren't, but this is why I think the multipolarity thing has so much more to it than just a simple sort of binary debate as to sort of, oh well, no, actually it's that. This is absolutely all part of it, and
yes.
And yeah, I mean, think of 2020 again. What an amazing example! The Church of England made £1 billion in 2020 off the back of stuff that, well, I mean, don't know. Was the church in on it? Did the church know? Well, yeah, effectively, the church was absolutely in on it because they are an interested party. The church commissioners sit on a fund of what was then £9 billion. So of course they're an interested party. They're going to make money out of decisions that governments and corporations make. So when governments and corporations act apparently in concert, then one really has to look at who's benefiting from that. But that again, the 2020 project was an absolutely prime example. Everybody made squillions, and as Ian Duncan Smith said at the outset, in those sort of early days, it was all so confusing. We just didn't really know what was happening. Ian Duncan Smith admitted totally candidly and without any sense that there was any impropriety. In the first instance, well, it was so terrifying. We knew. I mean, what is he on about? We knew that sort of covering our faces with bits of porous cloth was going to make all the difference. So therefore, obviously within the House of Commons, we were all asked to sort of look to our friends, to those that we knew. I mean, who can help out, as though there was nothing wrong with that. I mean, first of all, the whole thing was completely wrong. I'm not at all trying to suggest that there was a proper way of sticking bits of cloth over people's face. It shouldn't have happened even at all. But the fact that somebody who had been in line to run the country, I mean, he was leader of the opposition for a period of time, and yet he didn't think there was anything wrong in saying that supposedly democratically elected representatives should just call their mates to say, are you up for a government contract? I mean, I think that, again, tells one quite a lot.
Yeah.
I like your use of phrasing there, supposedly democratically elected. I had Patrick Fagan on my show a couple times. He was the chief behavioral psychologist or scientist at Cambridge Analytica. And in 2016, they were involved with a big nudging campaign, particularly on Facebook, where they tried to manipulate the voting of the US election. I don't know if you remember that. And Zuckerberg had to sit in front of Congress to explain things eventually. And when I had Brian on my show last week, which is coming out this week, he was talking about the fact that there's a huge psychological war going on also. The idea that somebody is democratically elected, well, how democratically elected are they really when you have Google and Facebook and huge private companies, quote unquote private companies, playing psychological wars with millions and millions and millions of people?
Yeah, well, it depends which way you want to look at it. But I mean, we could just start with the statistics, which is that any government in recent time, somebody, I dare say, will be able to thumb through a copy of something and tell me at which point this ceases to be true. But I'm not sure how far back you have to go through to find a time where an actual majority of people voted for the thing that happened. Because, of course, we always get the, by a landslide, and you get the way it's framed in the result, in that, yes, OK, the Labour Party beat the other party or whatever it is. And it's just, it's amazing. It's just this, but that's the system. We're just saying that's the system. We put that system in place. And so there we go. If you're not going to go along with it, well, I mean, tough luck. Is that really democracy when... I forget, I think it was only, I think I'm right, the Starmer administration that's in at the moment, I think was voted for by only 9 million people. Well, there are 45 million adults in the United Kingdom. So if 9 million voted for the Starmer government, then 36 million didn't. And yet here we are, apparently happy with that.
I don't think anybody's happy with it.
No, but you know what I mean. I mean, happy enough to go along with the system and just say, yeah, okay, well, better luck next time. It didn't really work out. It's not to describe that system as I mean, we're back to sort of defining terms. I don't want to sit here and have a pedant's revolt, but I mean, seriously, what do we actually mean by democracy?
Exactly.
It's a absolutely pointless concept. It's just yet another instance of manipulating the public consciousness in order to make them think that they're part of a process that they're actually not part of at all.
Have you read Hans Hermann Hoppe's book, Democracy, The God That Failed?
No, but that's an excellent name.
Yeah, it's very, very good. Hans Hermann Hoppe, Democracy, The God That Failed, and he makes the argument that democracy effectively benefits the oligarchy. It benefits the elite classes the most, the government and private or corporate classes the most, because it's an exceptionally weak system, and it can be infiltrated and is infiltrated very easily and all the time. And because remember,
I think though, Jerm, that's largely because of the way that it has been implemented. I mean, for example, corporate money, it comes into politics, and of course that creates vested interests. The party system creates vested interests because people only want to, they are wanting to obtain good jobs. If they should be elected, they want to obtain a good job within the party. And of course, in the meantime, their decisions are whipped. It's even worse in the United States, where there seems to be limitless, or at least no restrictions on how much money can be given to political interests, to political politicians and so on over there. What would democracy be like, even as it is largely at the moment? What would it be like if, for example, no external money was permitted to come into the election process whatsoever, that everybody, whether they were from a political party or stood as an independent, was given an identical budget from taxpayer money, and no other money was allowed to be spent? What would happen if at Hustings independents had the same status as people in political parties? Because at the moment in Hustings in the UK, if you're standing as an independent, or even if you're standing for a very small party, you're unlikely to be allowed to sit at the table with the Labour Party, the Tories, the Reform and the Greens. So, the issue, I don't think, is democracy in and of itself. It's the way that the system is gamed. It shouldn't be beyond the wit of humanity to create a level playing field where all voices that might want to take part get to take part equally. And before you know it, you might find that some people that are more interested in actually the community that they live in get to represent the voice of the people in the community that they live in. So, it's not, I don't think, I think we got to be, again, careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Now, there are other people that would argue that any centralization of power whatsoever is a bad thing. Maybe there's never been a true effort to sort of get to that point. But my observation of humanity is that we are always going to have people that want to be in control and want to be in charge. And so the question is, how are those impulses managed? Because the people that are inclined in that way tend to bully, cajole, or whatever in an effort to and otherwise manipulate in an effort to get their way. So it seems to me that if that is a part of the human race. If we have a small number of people a relatively small number of people that are inclined in that way, then the issue for the rest of us is how that gets managed, rather than because what's the alternative? Do we string them up against the nearest wall and shoot them, or what do we do? There's got to be a way that these impulses could be managed, and the first thing, it seems to me, is to take away the ability for them to fund the activities that or the nepotism or the corruption that exists.
Well, ironically, and also at the risk now of being called a CCP shill, but Carl Zaar has spoken about this a lot, even on my show, where he makes the point that, and I'm not, again, this is not now saying this is a good system, but this is a very effective system. The way the Chinese government works is that the state is the state, right? It doesn't change. So the framework is there. The only thing that changes here and there are members within the party, but they don't accept any kind of external funding for that exact reason, so that they can't be manipulated. Whereas when Trump leaves office, the entire government can change, the entire thing. And everything that he, quote unquote, did can be changed. So it's a very, very short-term operation. It's 4 or 5 years, and then it can change again. And so it's basically, like schizophrenic. Whereas the Chinese system is rock solid, stable, and they're working to the next 100 years. And you can only really get into those positions of power through decades of hard work and trust and loyalty, etc., etc. Sure, it has its warts, but there is a sense of foundational, cemented roots that can't really be infiltrated.
Well, I mean, I think I'd be interested in Charles's view of this, but I think there is a case to be made for the idea of the benign dictator. But what happens if the dictator is not benign? And what happens if the dictator is susceptible to external influence, no matter what, on the surface rules you may have in place? I mean, this is a very tricky.
Well, you get the Gulf states. There you go. I mean, Vanessa will point this out.
Right.
Where they will become susceptible to say, Israeli interests.
So I think I'm not certain that there is, a system which is, and I'm not sure that there's any system which is capable of operating and being not susceptible to external influence without the oversight of people. And
North Korea.
My point is that the issue isn't so much the system that you have. The issue is whether you are simply saying to the people that occupy the positions of so-called authority, you go right ahead. I'm not interested in what you're doing. And I think that is largely the problem with the West in particular at the moment, is that the fact that the majority of people don't want to engage, don't want to hold anybody to account, and are quite happy to leave them to it. That's not necessarily in our interests.
I don't know terribly much about the British political system, but do political parties in the UK receive a lot of donation and private funding?
Depends which political party. I mean, the Tories have a relatively restricted membership base, and they tend to accept quite a bit of corporate funding. The Labour Party would argue that they have a much broader membership base, and that they are mostly funded by individual donations, except for the fact that, of course, in their case, they get big donations from the unions. So if you are a member of a union in the UK, you are giving money to the Labour Party whether you like it or not. the smaller parties, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, certainly Reform is going to be, I guess, receiving money from corporate interests. But I don't, Charles, help me out, because I can't remember what the details of that might be.
I'd be a bit out of date. I mean, I know that Aaron Banks was giving considerable amounts of money to Reform prior to the 2024 general election, and that was an interesting one because of his links to various so-called defence companies, I think Kinetic being the main one. So it sort of looked like, again, it doesn't matter which way you vote, you're going to get the same outcome. Exactly where that's gone now, because of course Reform there's been quite a bit of ebb and flow, I think, at the higher level sort of say corporate view of Reform. I mean, Elon Musk, of course, being a good example. He dabbled with being interested and then sort of said he wasn't, and has had a go at Farage. I mean, it's all it's theatrical, but there is an effect. Exactly where any corporate support is coming from now for Reform, I must admit, I don't know. I'm not up to speed on that. But I think just two things I would add in. I think we're all far too used to the state having a level of control that is completely unwarranted and unnecessary, frankly. And so that's a big part of it. We talk about the idea of, what's the alternative? We have a slightly different process that we describe as being democratic, or we have a benign dictatorship, or this, that, and the other. I think actually the one thing that doesn't get talked about nearly enough is that all the various things that we think of the state as being responsible for, it should not be responsible for. And you could say, well, that's just leaving the door open for more corporate control. Well, yes, okay, you could look at it like that, but as this conversation is highlighting, well, what's the difference? And I think, again, to put perhaps this might be regarded as a positive spin on it. I mean, my point is always that, well, if for the sake of argument, the government didn't run an education programme, and let's face it, previously that was the case. I mean, it's still within living memory that changed, in the same way that it's within living memory that the health service became a state enterprise. All of these things can be done differently. Now, whether, like colonialism, where the path forked, it's impossible. We can never know whether it would have been better if such and such a thing hadn't happened or had happened, in the same way that we won't know now if we were to stop the National Health Service today, would the outcome tomorrow be better or worse? Well, that entirely depends on how it's managed, of course. So all of this, I concede, is entirely hypothetical. But the point that I would like to make is just to get people to think in the bigger context of, well, what aspects of our lives should really be controlled by a state? And my view is really very, very few. And they essentially are the idea of a government is just a pretty dull admin tool. It just does a few things for you, and that's why you're prepared to pay a small amount of tax to the government to make that happen. My view is that anything beyond that is unnecessary overreach, and it can only ever result in confusion and corruption. It's just too big to manage. Look at the waste. Also, going back to your point about China, and I know this at first hand because I have worked on the receiving end of government departmental budgets. The short-termism, exactly like you point out, the way that the entire government is swept away, results in short-termism in the extreme. Some government departments, or at least organisations that are funded by government departments, operate on a year-to-year basis. I mean, that makes life absolutely impossible. So the problem here is absolutely enormous, and it's one that doesn't really need to be made. And I think the reason so many people were turned over in their thinking in 2020 is because all of these things that we talk about, all of the excess, the corruption, the this, that and the other, going back to what day it is today, being Freedom Day, in actual fact, whilst these were sort of frustrations and inadequacies and corruptions and all that, they didn't really necessarily stop you from doing what you wanted to do in life. And then suddenly the hammer dropped in 2020 and people were stopped from doing what they were doing. I'm not talking about, you just had to go along with it, you had to comply. It wasn't that. It was just that the stuff that you wanted to do wasn't even there anymore. So you couldn't. So you really had to evaluate, well, what the heck is going on and why on earth should the state be telling me that I'm in danger or I'm going to make this person ill or any of those sorts of things that previously the state had absolutely no remit to be even engaging in conversation about, let alone articulating policy and legislation around. So I would say there's a lot of thinking to be done about the general principle of the state, the sort of parameters of what the state should and shouldn't do in the first place.
And that would be a really good reform, actually, wouldn't it? What you do is you remove the state's ability to demand money with menaces. This business of tax is absolutely at the heart of the whole thing, right? Now, Chris Coverdale makes the point that illegal wars are being funded by our tax dollars, and therefore if there is a war crime committed, that every one of us is responsible for that, and therefore we should not be contributing to the war machine through our taxes. And I agree with him 100%. But it goes beyond that. If any government thinks that their existence is justified, if they think they're doing a good job, then no problem. Remove the requirement to pay tax, make it a voluntary thing, and immediately you find the relationship between the individual and the state changing. Because if the individual feels that the state is not doing the right thing, they would at that immediately have the ability to withhold their cash. This should happen at local level as well. And in the past, people that I've been working with in the past have absolutely argued that council tax should be paid on the basis of a contractual agreement between the individual and the local authority. So if you want your bin collected, then you pay a little bit of money. If you want the fire service, which is funded through the local authority, to come to your house in the event of a house fire, you pay a little bit of money, and so on. But the absolute state-backed protection racket of the tax system is not a mandatory thing anymore. That would focus minds within the public sector very significantly if they felt that their livelihoods were at risk if they were not doing a good job. And maybe that's the place to start.
Well, that's an argument made by Murray Rothbard, voluntary taxation. It's quite possibly the most effective, I suppose, thought experiment, because we don't really know in practice what it would be like, but it is the best way to hold those in political power accountable. Which is why they don't want to implement it.
Of course.
Well, precisely. But also because they don't have to implement it, because they do have the monopoly on violence. And so, the entire system, the court system, the fact that the only people that are entitled to use violence is the state itself, that effectively turns the state into a mafia-style operation. And of course, along with the mafia, the mafia runs around taking money from local businesses in a particular city because they're running we will protect you. It's about your safety. We'll protect you. It's a protection racket. Well, increasingly, the language out of governments is the first role of government is to keep the people safe. So they're even acknowledging in their own rhetoric that what they're running is a protection racket.
What is the influence of the Crown on British politics?
It depends what your definition of the Crown is.
Go on.
Is that a helpful answer?
Go on. That's a bit of a cliffhanger.
I don't know. What? Let's go as simplistic as possible. The Queen now, I guess, the King.
No, that's the monarchy. I think the Crown is something very different. And again, the Crown represents the corporate state merger that we've been talking about, the empire that we've been talking about in the course of this conversation.
Then. All right, I mean the royal family, I suppose.
Well, the royal family is just a corrupt criminal enterprise, and the role of the monarch, it constitutionally has been is so watered down at this point that it's non-existent. So they are. Well, Charles, you can tell me if this is unfair, but it's definitely, it looks to me like it's pretty parasitic at this point.
Yes, well, I mean, I think what is obvious is that there is a directly beneficial effect from the sorts of causes, let's say, that members of the royal family have been able to advocate for. And I think as a very good example of that, talking about the Crown, I mean, the now king, since the beginning of the 1970s, has been a very strong advocate for, let's say, the environment, to give him the benefit of the doubt. Of course, that's in more recent times become climate change and this, that and the other. And without wanting to get too much into the weeds, it is impossible to ignore the coincidence in the enormous jump in profits of the Crown estate due to the fact that they have the offshore wind capability, if capability is quite the right word, the offshore infrastructure is sold by the Crown estate, and therefore they receive huge amounts of money off the back of policy that is shaped by this idea that climate change is a thing and that we can do something about it. Now, if you were the Prince of Wales and now the King, and you're saying that we're facing a climate catastrophe and you own the seabed, or supposedly own the seabed that then offshore wind turbines are put in, and then the Crown estate receives those funds, and then I'd have to check back through the detail, but this coincides rather remarkably between the distinction between the what's called the consolidated fund and the other one, which escapes my mind right now. But basically, it's to do with where money goes in that the government handles and where money goes out, and it's completely corrupt. I mean, it should not be allowed to happen like that. And there's no doubt that that what the Prince of Wales and now King has said has provided him with a direct financial, or the sort of the Crown estate, the corporation, the corporate side of it. Provide there's a direct benefit has been seen. I mean, that is completely improper, but somehow it exists, and not only that, but it is made to happen by the government and, of course, the corporations that actually carry out the work. So, yes, extremely unfortunate in terms of the way it looks, the way it is.
Okay, I see we are running out of time, so there isn't really space for any further analyses, but I am going to go and enjoy my Freedom Day. Yeah, South Africa.
What do you do on Freedom Day, Jerm? Or what does one do on Freedom Day rather than you specifically?
Record excellent podcasts for UK Column, it seems.
Exactly, and do what everybody else does. You go to the shopping mall and engage in consumerism. That's completely mindless.
All right.
Glad to hear it.
Yeah, so that
I shall not be doing that part.
About.
No, I shall not be doing that part.